Thank you very much, Sahiba. So now for our fourth and final presentation this afternoon, I'm happy to introduce Saie Shetye, and who is coordinator of the Migration and Asylum Project in New Delhi, and Divya Priyadarshini, an urban researcher in Delhi. So Saie and Divya will present their chapter titled "The Complexities of Construction Labor in India and the Invisibility of Laborers from the Global Value Chain."
Thank you so much, Tamar, for the lovely introduction. And thank you to everyone for giving us the opportunity from the beginning to be able to participate in the first conference that happened in India, which culminated into the book chapter. And I'll share my screen. Is is the is it full screen for everyone now?
Yes, it's perfect.
Yeah. Thank you so much for giving us this opportunity. And this is also effort that Saie and I took over years for writing, but also the field work. And it developed from an idea and the experience that we had during our work. Saie working elaborately and exhaustively in the trafficking sector, and I was working with the informal sector. And these were the questions that we always kept asking each other and also while we were doing our work. So the chapter is titled The Complexities of Construction Labor in India and the Invisibility of Laborers from the Global Value Chain. And as Hila mentioned, this is where we try to shift towards the informal aspect of the value chain, and we try to put more emphasis on the domestic value chain, trying to shift the focus towards a more bottom up approach and trying to understand how in domestic value chain, which then form a part of larger global value chains, exploitation of workers, especially the informal construction workers, take place. So the agenda is like we'll briefly talk about the Indian construction sector, then we'll talk about the methodology that we had for our research, and it is empirical in nature, qualitative methods we had used. We'll then talk about how we apply the labor approach, which was developed by Hila, and also how we draw from developmental approach that was developed by Professor Kotishwaran in the construction sector. And then we try to talk about the construction sector and the workers' vulnerability and why there is a need for a new framework, trying to say that we need to shift from a top-down approach of a framework to a bottom-up approach, which is more integrated into the lived realities of the workers, and how this entire worker-centric framework can be how we see the domestic value chain, especially in relation to the workers and construction workers in India. So the chapter tries to talk about the construction sector and its interdependence that is there between the construction sector and the numerous subsectors, both vertical and horizontal intersections within diverse value chain. We talk about vertical and horizontal intersections in the chapter because we see that construction sector in India and worldwide draws and relies heavily on different value chains, different supply chains that are forming apart from production till construction, and there are different levels of labors and different levels of corporations and employers that are involved in this value chain. The scale of the processes, phases, and stakeholders involved in the construction processes within these diverse value chains, such as design, production, conversion of raw materials into manufactured products, and on site construction, highlights the sector's economic significance. While GVC frameworks are useful for understanding exploitative practices such as trafficking or modern slavery in various industries, in the case of construction, they have largely been applicable to global markets or large scale projects that, whenever we talk about mega projects or mega infrastructure development that are taking place. And when we talk about mega projects or large scale projects, I'm sorry, I'm really sorry. I'm really sorry for this. So, whenever we talk about large scale projects, we see that there are large scale employers and large scale construction companies that are involved into these large scale projects like but whenever we talk about the smaller projects, whenever we try to see how the construction sector is working at the local level, these small on-site construction that are taking place, the laborers heavily rely on these sectors and not always on the large scale sectors. So, to address exploitation within national boundaries or at local levels, a shift from the global value chain framework to a domestic value chain framework is imperative. The sector is also characterized by pervasive informality. Many laborers are hired by subcontractors who themselves have been brought in on mere verbal contracts and through kinship networks. In spatiotemporal terms, these workers may be on site for limited periods only, frequently moving to new sites upon project completion or the conclusion of their own task. This movement can span single construction sites, cities, or across states and countries in India. We are talking about countries because there is a huge outflow of construction laborers from India to other countries, especially the Middle Eastern countries, and they are found there and in definitely exploitative conditions, rendering the nature of informal work in the construction sector ephemeral and mobile. And this is how where we try to frame this entire idea of circular migration, that they are the workers who are there in the construction sectors are not just in one site. They move between sites and also in between when there are no projects or when they are not doing any kind of work. They do back and forth from their or place of origin to the place of new work where they find. So they keep going back and forth for their to their homes and then coming back to new construction projects, construction locations. The methodology that we used was mostly qualitative and relies both on primary and secondary data sources. Analysis of secondary literature revealed that the Indian construction sector is highly fragmented, but that most studies focus on large projects such as real estate and infrastructure development, as I mentioned before. Fewer studies focus on small and short term construction projects whose labor force includes both skilled and unskilled workers. When we talk about skilled workers, we are talking about the ones who are into the planning process and doing the architectural stuff or something what we call as Raj Mistri in India. The local colloquial term for them is large Raj Mistri, who have gained some amount of training through different organizations and institutions that we have in India. And when we call about the unskilled workers, these are primarily the one, and as you can see in the picture also, the ones who directly come from their homes or places of origins, villages in India, and learn on site. So this differentiation is important in the chapter because based on this differentiation is where also the exploitation becomes highly imperative and apparent in the construction sector in India. To complete the picture, primary data was gathered through semi-structured interviews with construction workers and a sample of organizations in Delhi advocating for the rights of the construction workers. The study employed mixed approaches in the field, that is, there were semi-structured interviews, participant observation, and we also engaged in non-participant observations where we were just trying to observe how the everyday life of the construction workers and the construction sites was emerging before us to understand the nuances of construction labor and if at all any exploitation that is happening at the site or before or after during the process is what we were trying to identify. The fieldwork was conducted from September to November 2019 in the National Capital Territory of Delhi. And to highlight the nuances of construction work, we selected two residential buildings since we are trying to focus on short-term construction projects and not large mega infrastructure development projects, we tried to focus on two residential building sites that were being developed in one of the posh localities of Delhi. And the houses were actively under construction. That is, there was inflow outflow of migrant workers, there was inflow outflow of people, and therefore these were the two sites for our. So, whenever we talk about worker vulnerability in the Indian construction sector, then there are approximately 74 million construction workers in India, and the hierarchies are fluid. As I mentioned before, like there is one clear distinction between them being skilled and unskilled labor. Then there are distinctions between who is skilled to do what kind of work. Someone is doing cementing, someone is doing the architectural stuff, someone is specialized in electrification. And in those also there are hierarchies, and we are talking about fluid hierarchies because the roles keep on changing. As we said, that most of the unskilled workers come to the site as not knowing what the process of construction are, and they learn on the job. And it is when they learn on the job they gain the skills to get promoted to a different level within the unskilled workers, but at a higher level, and therefore the roles and the hierarchies become fluid. It's highly fragmented in nature, and it is the second largest employment sector in India after agriculture. And it's migration driven by the quest to break free of social hierarchical structures that are existent. We try to emphasize on these because we say that India, and we know that India is heavily agriculture based economy, and people, and it is also one of agriculture is also one of the largest employment employers in India. However, the people, the circular migrants, the workers whom we are talking about, they try to move out of the villages not because they couldn't find agricultural work in their villages, but in order to break the socio-cultural hierarchies, specifically to mention the caste hierarchies that are very deeply ingrained in the villages of India. So, therefore, it is a motivation to come out of those subjugations and exploitations which they face at the village level, which further leads to their exploitation in the construction workers as circular migrants. And now I will pass it to Saie to take forward and explain to us how we used the development approach and the labor approach, and also how we developed our framework, which we try to propose should be having a bottom-up approach. Saie?
Hi, thank you, Divya, for that. Um, we our starting point was looking at some frameworks that question the traditional response to trafficking, which is the rescue and rehabilitation sort of a response. So we did rely heavily on Hila Shamir's work. We also looked at Prabha Koteshwaran's work, and we do align with them on some aspects, and then there are points of departure, which I'll discuss in a little more detail. Um, I think a common thread between both of their work is the questioning of the traditional anti-trafficking response, which also, amongst other things, focuses heavily on on commercial sexual exploitation, uh, while ignoring exploitation within the labor sector. Um, we do resonate when Shamir says that human trafficking is better understood as predominantly an issue of economic labor market exploitation, and therefore proposes a labor approach to trafficking to deal with the phenomenon. A point of departure, in very brief, from her work is what Divya also spoke about, where we see the Indian construction sector being highly fragmented. We also see that roles played by people within the value chain change across construction sites, across cities. A lot of hiring is informal, and another very prominent feature of the construction sector is the circularity, which also Divya has mentioned, where we see that people move between rural and urban or between their hometown and other regions where they move for construction. So while they could be agriculture laborers through the harvest season, agriculture harvest season, they move to construction sectors during the lean periods only and then go back. And hence, they are also heavily dependent on social security benefits, for example, at their source areas and not so much at the places of work. Further, Prabha Koteshwaran's work is a lot more rooted in Indian realities, where she does also use examples of schemes in India that are rooted in Indian realities of bonded labor or of forced labor or where wages are not paid. Um, but she also does not take into consideration the various other factors that could be motivation for migration. For example, like Divya just mentioned, there could be a motivation to move out of the caste hierarchies, which are a lot more prominent in rural parts of India as compared to urban parts of India. Not to say that they don't exist in urban parts. There are other motivations, like my earlier research found that uh, women migrants in the state of Maharashtra take up risky migration when they, because of the non-normative lives that they could be living, their social relations break down, and then the only option they kind of feel is to move out of the structures that they are born in. So and that is where we see a point of departure from the two frameworks that we're talking about. Um, we do briefly look at the legislation, and India only very recently also enacted some labor codes, so four new labor codes. When we wrote this chapter, they were still they had not been passed. We did take a look at the bills, but we do depend more on in the analysis on the predecessor of the present labor codes that we have, which is the Building and Construction Workers Act. Um, we did see very poor registration of workers due to the lack of awareness, circular nature of migration that I mentioned. So a lot of the workers, not just not being aware, but also because they're dependent on social security benefits back at their home place, don't really see a benefit in registering themselves in urban areas or even in semi-urban areas where they find construction work. Further, some of these social security benefits also require them to have some address proof or an ID proof for the places where they're working. And these schemes don't have universal applicability. Hence, there is poor registration of workers. We um, we do share that photo as an example of what a very informal sort of a record of work looks like. Uh, it was only where we saw unions, trade unions, or workers' unions intervening that we saw more detailed documents of registration of workers under the Act to be able to then access social security benefits. But in the absence of unionization, unfortunately, or of an external agency that aided this registration, one would at best see these kind of documents. The reason these documents become important is to be able to access social security benefits, one has to be registered as a construction worker for 90 days in a year. And if the 90 days are not recorded on a document, in which, in the case of the photo, you see those don't get recorded correctly, then you are not able to access the social security benefits. Um, yeah. Um, Moving on, I think a lot of this has been covered, but I'll quickly maybe just stress on the points that have not been covered. So, like Divya said, our work focused essentially on short-term construction projects where individuals were reconstructing or redeveloping their own houses, or it could be smaller projects where a group of individuals could be doing that. And the observations were that construction workers were moving from one side to the other. Now, this movement from one side to the other in urban Delhi that we studied was very often through kinship networks that they had developed. So, if there were construction workers migrating from a particular state of India, then through word of mouth or through the other people from neighboring villages or from their villages, they found out about new construction projects and moved to those projects. Another way a lot of construction sector hiring, especially for small projects, happens in India is there is a very, and I think this is true for a lot of South Asian countries. There are these labor chalks or literally crossroads where laborers collect every morning, where employers will go. And these can be individuals who want to get small construction work done in their house to maybe a building construction. Employers or middlemen will go directly there and hire workers for maybe 2, 3 days at a time. So we're looking at time-bound projects where there's also a critical role for middlemen to play, who often are not really the typical contractors or subcontractors we're talking about, but could just be a friend who's telling a worker that, hey, there is a job available at the construction site where I'm working, and why don't you join me? And that's where they move from one construction site to the next construction site. What happens in this process is the lack of negotiating power, because you're not really often negotiating with anybody in control of anything. You're just joining a friend of yours to go to the next construction site. We also observed that there was a heavy gender divide, where it's not just the wages, differential wages that women and men earn, but also um, even within the fragmented construction sector, the progression that men or women were able to make, women ended up being helpers for a much longer period, while men progressed at least to some form of semi-skilled work, even within these small construction sites. I think we have, yeah. Um, Again, like I think a better version of this is in the book if anybody is interested. But we've tried to paste this supply chain over here, labor supply chain. All the L's are essentially laborers. What we're essentially trying to communicate through this is the highly fragmented nature of the construction sector. And the dependence on kinship networks, a lot of informality in the hiring process. Mm, which also then creates these zones of vulnerabilities. Um, Towards the end of the chapter, we do move towards a new framework, taking into consideration some of the things that we've just spoken about, of fluidity of roles, of the fragmented nature of hiring, of the informality, of the circular nature. And the reason we propose the development of a new framework is because some of these factors have not been taken into consideration in policy formulation or in theorization of the construction sector. Um, I think there again is like a diagram of a framework. So what we propose is intervention at various levels, taking into consideration lived realities at these various levels. So it can be at the source, where there can be agriculture distress. Um, um, like I mentioned earlier, this need to live a dignified life, break out of the caste system or the social structures that, in some sense, some people find limiting. Um, then we see the circular nature or the seasonal nature of migration, where one sees people moving from the agriculture sector to the construction sector and back to the agriculture sector in India. Um, And the hiring, like I mentioned, happens through kinship networks and a lot of subcontracting. So we suggest point of intervention over here to increase bargaining power, social security policies that take this feature into consideration, the circularity of migration, introducing universal applicability of some of these social security benefits, which would mean that even if people return back to their roots or to their origin, they're not outside the scope of social security benefits, thus increasing their bargaining power or reducing their vulnerability to exploitative hiring practices. And the final point of intervention is in areas where they move to for work, where there is a need for trafficking laws or even labor laws to take into consideration the circular nature of migration. We do not see trafficking laws in India being able to address this specific issue at all because of the fluidity of the roles that I mentioned. It's not that within the scope of what we studied, we could identify a trafficker or a trafficked person. There was a lot of fluidity of roles. Um, and labor laws to this date do not take into account, while there are a lot of recommendations, including a Supreme Court judgment, they do not take into account the circular nature of migration and the fact that a lot of laborers miss out on social security benefits because of the circular nature of that migration. Yeah, I think I will end here.
Thank you very much, Saie and Divya. And thank you all for these rich and important contributions. Taken together, the 4 chapters reflect the multi-layered view of labor governance in global value chains that we hope we offer in the book. They move between different analytical scales from the level of international legal and trade instruments through national due diligence frameworks to the lived realities of workers navigating recruitment systems and construction labor markets in India. Across this analysis, we see how regulatory tools may open windows for intervention, yet remain constrained by structural power imbalances inherent to supply chain capitalism. These chapters also highlight persistent tension between formal promise of governance mechanism and the informal, often precarious realities shaping workers' everyday lives. This contrast is especially vivid when we move from debates about trade instruments and mandatory due diligence to Sahiba's analysis of recruitment control in Nepal GCC pathways and to Saie and Divya's attention to the invisibility of construction workers in Delhi's urban economy. So together, what we see is that labor governance cannot be understood only through top-down regulatory frameworks. It must also be examined, not only examined, actually, implemented through the micro practices of recruitment, mobility, and survival that shape workers' experiences on the ground. This expanded lens, I hope, helps us see how governance tools travel unevenly across borders, sectors, and forms of vulnerability, and why their effectiveness often depends on political will, institutional capacity, and workers' own strategies. So before I turn to the Q&A session, I will present each of the speakers an individual question, followed by one shared question for the panel. When you reply, I'm talking now to the speakers, I also invite you to elaborate on any points in your chapters that you consider especially significant or relevant, or to relevant insights from the work you've done after writing these chapters. After that, the speakers will have the opportunity to respond to questions from the participants here. So, Franz, Your chapters show both the potential and the limitation of trade instruments for addressing forced labor in supply chains. You mentioned the palpable remedial action in the rubber glove sector, and I wonder what you think contributed to this outcome. At the same time, I want to ask you, where do you see the greatest risk that these instruments remain ineffective rather than genuinely transformative, and what design features would be necessary to prevent their ineffectiveness or to make them more transformative? Ingrid, your chapters raises important concerns about the rarity of effective remedy under. It's actually quite interesting that France's case emphasizes the remedial phase, and so I wonder if you can talk about that too. But in any case, if we can extend the optimistic note you strike at the end, could you elaborate on the institutional and the political shifts needed to transform HRDD from a primarily reporting-oriented mechanism into one that genuinely redistributes power toward affected workers and communities? And of course, on the barriers that may prevent such shifts, but let's try to be optimistic. Sahiba, your chapter really compellingly shows that the Nepal GCC migration corridor functions as an employer-driven human supply chain, with employers acting much like lead firms in buyer-driven value chains. You apply GVC framework, and you, by doing that, demonstrate that recruitment abuses are structural outcomes of employer purchasing practices rather than isolated misconduct, and that meaningful social upgrading would require changing the contract terms employers impose on recruiters. So, building on this conclusion, could you elaborate on what you see as the most realistic pathways for achieving such employer-led social upgrading? And relatedly, how might the kind of empirical evidence you call for be leveraged to strengthen accountability under national or international law? And Saie and Divya, your chapter proposes a worker-centric framework that brings the full circular trajectory of migration, labor governance into view, emphasizing how employability and the destination is deeply shaped by caste, landholding, gender hierarchies, and other structures at the point of origin. You also show how these stratifications are reproduced through kinship networks, subcontracting layers, and the fragmented nature of hiring in the construction sector. And you point to possible intervention at the source, in transit, and at the destination of employment. So building on this comprehensive framework, could you elaborate on where you see the most promising and, again, realistic points of intervention for applying such a framework? And now for the shared question, we can see how labor governance is increasingly shaped by wider geopolitical and economic shifts. Recent signs of economic deglobalization point to a more fragmented, or even more fragmented and politically charged economic order, reshaping trade regimes, labor mobility, and global regulatory frameworks. So, given this context, how do these geopolitical transformations affect the prospects for meaningful labor governance in your areas of analysis, or not in I'm interested in this question in any context, actually, in our work on labor exploitation and labor governance. So if you have insights on it, I'll be glad to hear. So it's yours now.
Tamar, maybe before we let them answer, maybe we can pick a few questions from the audience
Sure.
as well, and then let them answer all together.
All
So
right.
if anybody has a question for our speakers, this is your time. Can feel free to either raise your hand or just unmute yourselves and ask the question. Katrina.
My question is for Franz. Thank you for your presentation. I've long been an admirer of your work, so it's actually really exciting to meet you. I'm working on forced labour bans and trade instruments in the cocoa industry, looking at modern slavery in the cocoa industry. It's more of a comment, but I'm really interested in how these trade measures actually filter down to the workers. You suggested on a company level there were some positive implications, but also loss of jobs. I did my PhD on the impact of EU trade, the GSP, on workers' rights in the garment industry. In Bangladesh, there was a lot of fear from unions, trade unions, that the GSP would be withdrawn and that they would lose their jobs. And then the question then was, well, if we lose our jobs, then we will turn to more exploitative industries like the sex industry, which was a very real fear amongst the workers there. And just reiterates the need on how do you protect workers when you engage in these trade instruments that are, taking away those trade benefits. Yeah, but fantastic to meet you. Yeah, really exciting.
Hila, do you want to add your questions?
Maybe I have one question for Sahiba and Saie and Divya, and then one for Ingrid and Franz. So one of the central themes that kind of is raised throughout the book and that I mentioned about the introduction is that modern slavery emerges along a continuum of vulnerability, shaped not only by global production structures, but also by deep-rooted labor market and development dynamics. Now, both of your chapters show in very different empirical sites how workers become vulnerable long before they enter a workplace, right? Whether through employer-driven human supply chains in the Nepal GCC corridor, or through the informal and highly fragmented domestic value chains of the Indian construction sector. So given your findings, I'm wondering, how would you think about the relationship between GVC governance and the deeply local, informal, socially embedded labor markets you studied? And more specifically, do GVC frameworks risk missing the most important drivers of exploitation because they are so kind of institutional focused? Will they underplay informality, migration systems, social hierarchies? Or do you think because Sahiba's chapter really tries to take that literature into migration, and I wonder if you found it helpful. And where do you feel, all of you, where do you feel it has blind spots, right? Or conversely, can the analytical tools of GVC governance help illuminate and potentially maybe transform exploitation even when it unfolds far from export-oriented segments of the chain? So kind of, in other words, based on your research, what does it take to design governance interventions, whether labor or development, corporate focus, that actually reach workers in these invisible, fragmented, and highly mobile labor markets? And for Franz and Ingrid, so we in the introduction, I talked about the convergence between modern slavery policies and GVC governance, and how it generated this proliferation of state-driven regulatory tools. But the evidence remains mixed about these tools, right? Can they reshape information architecture, create incentives? Maybe, but they often fall short of addressing the structural conditions that produce modern slavery, right? That was kind of the argument we made in the introduction of the book. Now, your chapters examine two of the most prominent state-led regulatory strategies, trade instruments and MHRDD, and both in theory promise to leverage state power to shift corporate behavior. But based on your analysis, do these tools meaningfully alter the structural dynamics that enable modern slavery and GVCs, or do they risk reinforcing a compliance-oriented, top-down model that stops short of real accountability and remedy? So Franz, more concretely, in your examination of trade instruments and import bans, when do economic levers actually lead to durable improvements rather than these short-term compliance or unintended harms? Do you have like a clue for us in that direction? And Ingrid, your chapter shows how MHRDD laws rarely deliver remedy, despite promising to do so. And I wonder, what does this reveal about where responsibility and enforceability really lie within GBC governance. So taken together, how far can these state-driven tools go in transforming power relation in global supply chains? And where must other actors or other forms of regulation step in to bridge the gap? Thank you. Anyone else before we let the authors respond?
Just another question. I pretty much wanted to ask the same question that you asked. So I'll just add to that. And that's a very broad question, but what kind of solutions, and this is aimed to everybody participating in the book, but what kind of solutions do you identify that aren't necessarily policy regulation kind of solution, but more of a structural, culture, economic solutions?
So I think we can let the speakers answer. Who would like to start? Tamar, do you want to take it from here?
Yes, so let's do the opposite. Let's start from Saie and Divya, and then go Sahiba, Ingrid, and Franz. Is that okay?
Yeah, that works. Hold on, I didn't note the question. Yeah. I think Tamar, we'll start by addressing your question first, where you asked us to elaborate on promising points of intervention. I think one point of intervention, and which we very briefly mentioned during the presentation, is the universal applicability of some of these social security benefits. So the way for construction workers it works in India is that they have to register with a particular government department in the place where they are working, and because of the movement of these workers, if it is within the city, uh, then they essentially register at in the same place, but most often they are not in the same city throughout. And because they move from one side to the other, from one district to the next, sometimes in rural areas, sometimes in metropolitan cities. Um, and I would also point out to the fact that construction workers actually, in theory, have some of the best social security benefits written down in law and policy in India. But because of the movement and the circular nature of migration, they are unable to access this. So, universal applicability of these schemes, so it doesn't matter which city they're working, some sort of an arrangement where there is a centralized system that can move the benefits to wherever the construction worker is at that point when they need benefits, like education support for their children. There are benefits of medical support in case of an injury. There are old age pension schemes that are linked to construction workers. So I think that is a very practical point of intervention. And we do see a lot of promise in universal applicability of Social Security. And we did see a huge difference in even the maintenance of a record, the card that we showed, where in the absence of an intervention of a union, the record of the days is very badly maintained. While when we saw, and this, if people want to take a look at the comparison, we do have photos of both these cards in the book chapter. The one where the union intervened is a lot more detailed, takes into account all the family members. Has a lot more detailed record of the days of employment, which then helps them access the social security benefits. So, yeah, Divya, please feel free to add anything if you want to.
Yeah, say you have actually taken two important point of intervention that we are trying to advocate for. One is the universal applicability, and second, as Say was mentioning about the card. So precisely, we want to say that if there is proper registration, if there is proper identification of who are actually into the construction labor, and that is maintained, we can improve the collectivization also. And once we are able to identify the construction workers, all the policies and frameworks which are there also existent in India then can be properly implemented. So we identified, and as we were trying to say, the problem isn't with not having policies and laws to protect the construction workers, but the problem is because of their circular migrant nature, the fluidity that they have, and the larger frameworks that we use actually fail to identify. So if we want to put it in a
Yeah,
simple line,
I just need you to make it a bit shorter because we are running out
yeah,
of time.
sorry. So we are just trying to advocate for
Yeah.
a bottoms-up approach where the laborers also form an important part of the framework and they are identified.
Thank you so much, Sahiba.
Thanks. Okay, so on the most realistic pathways for employer-led social upgrading, I think there are some rare examples of strict liability in employer jurisdictions for lead firms for any recruitment fees. And I really think that is the ideal solution, and it's just a matter of political will. But following up from that, if you imagined that there was a jurisdiction with strict liability, I think there's two ways that the empirical research can help strengthen outcomes for workers. One is liability for violations beyond fees. What I've tried to get at in my chapter is that perhaps much of what is framed as informality or natural or taken for granted is actually the product of choices that are actually being made in another country about how this human supply chain is managed. And the second is genuinely the process of recruitment itself. What I briefly alluded to is that this is a pretty complex process, and GVC analysis can help us see the complexity and potentially develop contracts and penalties in a way that manages it without leading to abuses. But there are limits. It might be slower. It might be costlier for employers, and that is a different situation from the one. It would require a different commitment from employers who basically truly outsource the entire work of recruitment now, outsource a complex process, and then are happy to push the costs of not dealing with complexity onto workers. I'm mindful of time, so I'm happy to come back and answer other questions, but I'll pass it on to the other contributors.
Thank you, Ingrid.
Okay. Let me first start by saying it's 1 a.m. here in Melbourne, and sorry if I'm slightly incoherent in answering the questions. I can't even read my own writing, but I'll try. So first question from Tamar was about asking me to elaborate on institutional and political shifts that might help redistribute kind of power in a way to make remedy more meaningful as a part of mandatory human rights due diligence laws. I mean, the first kind of most obvious is kind of like the strongest provisions within the laws, and I think the EU CS, so the EU directive until kind of the last couple of months really had this kind of by far the most multidimensional, strongest provisions on remedy. Some of those provisions may still make it through the current, given the revisions that have just been agreed upon by the Council and Parliament, but it's not clear until further detail comes out. Second one, I think, issue here is around the importance of strategic alliances to maximise the potential of the laws, strategic alliances between unions and organisations in the global north and the global south. And this got me thinking about another research project Hila and I and Shelley just completed, looking at how global unions are trying to kind of use the mandatory human rights due diligence laws, including through building kind of capacity and building alliances with organisations in the global south. And I think also using, and again, kind of drawing on that project, the capacity of actors to leverage the laws to negotiate binding agreements with companies around remediation. So they have kind of stronger kind of binding obligations, enforceable obligations on remediation in kind of private governance arrangements, basically. Third point, I guess, would be, I think that I hope that as we have more and more of these tools, including that there is kind of more strategic thinking around when there is kind of remedy needed, looking not just at what tools will kind of give some positive result, but what remedies are available through what tools, and then thinking more strategic about, okay, what remedies are needed, and then looking for the right tool, which might be a mandatory human rights due diligence law, but might be something quite different. On the second question, I think, which is around the political shifts, or actually, there's only 4 minutes, so I'm going to leave it there and pass it over to Franz.
You owe me one.
Yeah, thanks so much, Tamar, and everyone for all these great questions. Obviously, it's very hard, at least for me, to do justice to them in the time available. But hopefully, this can also be the beginning of a conversation that we can continue elsewhere. Nonetheless, I'll try, and maybe starting then with Tamar. What contributed to the outcomes in the rubber glove sector case? I think there are a number of factors. In addition to those I've already mentioned, I would just like to highlight again, in this case, we really had a heavy reliance of the Malaysian rubber glove sector on the US market, which is also its largest importer. So that link, that market link was really important. And I think this is also something that resonates with research findings on other trade instruments. I would also highlight that this was really reinforced by these aligned actions from other actors that I had mentioned. And another factor that may have contributed as well was that there was a relatively direct engagement of the United States customs authorities with the companies, providing quite specific guidance in terms of what they felt they needed to see done with a view to removing the ban. And perhaps the last factor which I would mention that's a more circumstantial one is the pandemic, actually, that led to the substantial profit margins achieved by the Malaysian rubber glove sector, which also, I think, contributed to these companies being able to relatively easily dispersing these funds that I've mentioned, for example, for reimbursing the recruitment fees. Limitations, yeah, I mean, there are many. The import bans are, in this case, at least company focused, and as such did not address, at least not directly, the many or several legal and institutional obstacles that persist, which include restrictions on migrant workers becoming union leaders and other unionization obstacles, also certain capacity challenges within the labor inspectorates that are often mentioned. And we really also have to see yet the economic long-term effects of these import bans. Maybe that I'll leave it there on this point, so have at least a bit of time to address the interesting question or comment by Katrina. Thanks so much for that question. And I think you've asked about the adverse effect on the EU GSP context. No, also trade sanctions, slightly different instrument. And it's very interesting because the question of adverse effects, at least to my understanding, are very much understudied. The research that we have mainly relates more to the limitations in terms of positive effects, not that much to the negative effects. But we do have some anecdotal evidence, for example, for the case of Myanmar, for example, from the early 2000s, which was subject to different types of trade sanctions under the GSP, labor-related and otherwise. And here, the evidence suggests very much what you were also hinting at, that in that case, for example, apparently textile workers, mostly female, were quite strongly affected by these sanctions, and then where they actually lost their work and were indeed relegated, at least partly, to the sexual services industry, if I can call it that. Regarding improving legal design, obviously there are a lot of technical details we could discuss, but I'd focus more on maybe the structural issues, really, to wrap it up also. And that question that Hila asks, and I think to some extent also Tamar, is of course, it's very difficult to answer. Do these instruments reinforce the business model? Probably, it's too early. I find the research is not there. I would see that it's like the research focuses usually on these much more short-term effects. And what I would say about the broader structural effects is that for more durable improvements, my hunch would be, but again, we really need more research in this regard, that my hunch would be that one key challenge is to see how we can harness this momentum generated by import bans, for example, and how this can be effectively leveraged to strengthen the ongoing efforts of, for example, local actors, social partners, civil society actors, etc., that are perhaps more focused in their efforts on some of the root causes. But for that, we need more interaction between the different mechanisms, perhaps also more interactional awareness. And more broadly speaking, definitely also more consultations with local stakeholders, also with a view to better cushioning some of the negative effects that may be there. Again, some actors have mentioned the possibility of impact assessments. We're not there yet, but that would be at least a valuable consideration to give it some more thoughts. Beyond that, I feel also that we might be easily asking too much of these trade instruments when we are looking, for example, at the structural conditions. I'm a lawyer, so I'm not fully. We have to wrap it up, right?
Yeah, sorry.
Okay, I'll leave it there. Exactly.
It's really very interesting. I'm happy we have 2 more events.
Yeah, exactly. I'll wrap it up there. I'll just say there is a risk of asking too much of these instruments in terms of the structural elements for supply chain governance. And I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Hila?
So thank you, everybody. We're already a little bit over time. I really want to thank our speakers for sharing their wonderful chapters, and I want to encourage all of you to read the book. It's open access. This was a launch for the book, but it was also part of the Change Lab collaboratory. And if you're interested, our next meeting is going to be with Urmila Bula, who's here. Who's going to be presenting a wonderful report she is working on. So we'll be discussing that, and we'll have additional details forthcoming. So stay tuned. Thank you very much. Thank you, Tamar, for leading the discussion. And
thank you, Hila, for everything.
And I hope to see you all soon. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Yeah, thanks very much, guys.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.